Joe, do you want me to put on automatic captions?
Sorry, say it again.
Do you want me to put on automatic captions?
Yes, that might be good. Thank you. So Richard is asking, what are they, the automated captions? There should now be appearing, Richard, on the screen, if that works.
Can everyone see that?
Great, okay. Okay, I think most people are now in, so welcome again to the Center of Educational Neuroscience seminar series, and it's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Michael Thomas today, who is the director of the Center of Educational Neuroscience. And it's a great pleasure because Michael Thomas is here to introduce the new book that was produced by members of the Center of Educational Neuroscience. And he didn't bring up the title of the book, but I hope he'll mention it because I guess it's more than just educational neuroscience. Is that right, Michael?
No, it's broadly just educational neuroscience.
Educational neuroscience. There you go. Fantastic.
There's some subtitles, but I'll explain where they came from.
That's great. If you've got any questions for Michael, you can either type them in the chat or unmute yourself or raise your hands at the end of it. So thank you very much, Michael, for your talk today, and I'll give the floor to you now.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Joe. Okay, so am I able to advance the slides? Okay, so yes, there's the title of the book. I'm going to be talking about educational neuroscience, development across the lifespan. So this book turned out to be, I think, 500 pages long and reassuringly expensive, which I'll get to later on. So I can't cover all of the content about what went into the book, and indeed many of the component chapters could form talks in and of themselves. But what I'm going to try and do today is to tell you something about what our goals for the book and the extent to which kind of we felt that as editors we achieved those goals. So this book's co-edited with Denis Marichal and Iroise Dumontaille, and I don't necessarily want to talk on their behalf. So if they turn up in this seminar and they have different views, I'll be more than happy for them to jump in and say where they agreed or disagreed. Okay, so the context of this book, the Center for Educational Neuroscience, or many of the researchers, we came together to produce an edited volume back in 2013. The editors were Denis Marichal, who reappears in the current volume, Brian Butterworth and Andy Tomey. 7 years between books, and a different but related group of editors. So how was it that we went from the initial book, and how does it come about that we have the new book? Obviously, our goal was to update the contents to a fast-moving field. So how does it start then that we ended up producing this book? How do any of these academic books start? Well, there's two ways you can go. Either you have an idea for a volume and you approach a publisher and you make a proposal about what you think would be a good book and why it would sell and why people would be interested in it. The other way it can work is that the publishers think there's an opportunity for a book or a demand for a book, and they contact you. So that was the case here, where there was some series editors. This is for Psychology Press, who thought it was timely to have a new book on educational neuroscience. And this was an email I received, the first communication with the publishers. And you can see that that was back at the beginning of 2016. So the book, in the title of this seminar, I've called it The New Book. I think it was published somewhere in the first lockdown back in April of last year. So I'm still going to call it new. But you can see that that took 4 years from this initial email to actually having that book appearing available for purchase. So it's quite a long time to do a book project, and you'll probably see why that might be by some of the steps that we had to go through. If you look at this invitation, it was from the series editors. So these are editors commissioned by the publishers to try and put together a series of books on a common theme. And their common theme in this case was frontiers in developmental science. And the series editors had a particular vision that, as they say here, our vision for the series is to have edited volumes with common themes of lifespan development, individual differences, and cross-cultural influences. So although they were interested in a volume on educational neuroscience, they did indicate a particular slant that they wanted us to think about lifespan, to think about development, individual differences, and cross-cultural influences. I think I'm going to admit up front that we didn't necessarily hit all of those targets. We didn't really cover cross-cultural influences as much as I would have liked. But then you can see the reason for the subtitle, why we had individual differences across the lifespan, development across the lifespan. That was to do with fitting in with the particular slant of the series of books. Okay, so let's think a little bit about the evolution, about how we go from the 2013 book. I'm not sure how many years it took that book to come to fruition. So maybe that took 3 years. So that maybe started in 2010. And you can have a look at the state of the field, what those editors thought should go into that volume. You can see in this case, it's 350 pages, so a shorter volume. They start with an introduction. They talk about, I'd say, several of these chapters, early chapters, are kind of methods chapters about what kind of methods the scientists are using who are working in educational neuroscience. So neuroimaging methods, computational modeling, genetics, research methods in educational psychology. And then there appear to be, the second half of the book is some particular topics. So we got language development, literacy development, mathematical development, scientific reasoning. Those seem to be more about kind of academic topics or particular abilities. And then the last 3 chapters are kind of social development, emotional development, attention, and executive control. So it's kind of methods and then some kind of topics. But you could probably say that looks broadly like a psychology book. There's no kind of involvement of teachers and educators in there. There's no kind of teacher's voice. The foreword is from a famous researcher in the study of attention. There is at the end an afterword of John Brewer. He has famously been skeptical about educational neuroscience. Certainly back in the 1990s, he thought the translation of neuroscience into education was premature, and the editors managed to get him to comment on the book, and he kind of grudgingly said, "Oh yeah, things are a bit better maybe around 2010 than they were in the 1990s." Okay, so we've been commissioned by the publishers. They want us to write a book in their series on educational neuroscience. And then we have to decide what sort of book to write. And I think there are at least 3 different types of book you could write. And one is tempted when one's having one's wish list of what goes into the book to try and hit all of these targets at once. But I'm not really sure that's possible within a coherent volume, that you're trying to speak to too many audiences at once if you try and do this. You can have a teacher-focused volume, which really is focusing on teachers' experience, the challenges they face in the classroom, what neuroscience research means to them, how really focusing on the translation and how research might address the teachers' the challenges they're facing day to day. In the end, we chose not to do that. If you're interested in that kind of material, we are accumulating interviews with teachers on the Center for Educational Neuroscience website. So do go and have a look at that. But that could be the target of a volume. Or you could really be trying to pull together all the practical tips that teachers could use, the methods they could use, the techniques that would pass what one might call the Monday morning test. Here's something that teachers can use in the classroom on a Monday morning. In that case, the neuroscience would be in the background as the inspiration, but the focus would be on practical tips. The third type of volume you could have is something that summarizes the current state of the research that might be translatable. Tries to put maybe a little bit of the teacher perspective in on the research. And I think we were more sensitive. All of that research gets into the classroom and what teachers think about that. And indeed, we have a section in the book which is called Into the Classroom, as you'll see. And some of the teachers' viewpoint on the content of the book was summarized in a chapter by Derek Bell and Helen Darlington, and you will be presented. You have the opportunity to have a whole session on that next week. Derek and Helen have kindly agreed to kind of give the teacher's viewpoint, summarize what they thought of the research in the book. Okay, so once you've agreed with the publishers that you're going to write this volume, the next thing you have to do is to actually put down a proposal to the publishers about what you want to put in the volume. So that's a document of a few pages of length, arguing how does your book fit into the current books out there in the market. What is it offering that's new, and what will be your ideal structure for the book. And then when the publishers get that proposal, they will send it out to expert reviewers who might come back with feedback, and then the publishers, on the basis of the reviewers' opinions, will decide whether to commission the volume or not. So I've got a couple of slides here that just indicates what we put in the proposal. So at this stage, it's more of a sort of a vision for how we'd like this volume to turn out. So we kind of showcased it. Here's the context. Educational neuroscience faces a triple challenge, trying to build an evidence base of neuroscience research relevant to education, of trying to identify and translate findings through a dialogue with educators into methods that are robust and effective in the classroom, and at the same time dispelling neuromyths or kind of premature translation into practice. And then we talked about what other books are out there, certainly at this time, back in 2016. There are books out there that argue for the importance of the enterprise of educational neuroscience, the potential of the field, as it were, such as Blakemore and Frith's The Learning Brain. There are simplified kind of accounts written for a popular audience, so Sousa's How the Brain Learns in 2011. And there are more kind of serious academic tomes which debate the merits of this kind of interdisciplinary research. And there's an example in 2012 of an edited volume, Neuroscience in Education, by Della Sala and Anderson. And then, of course, there's our 2013 book, which we hoped at least was a kind of source book for the state of the art of the field at the time. But so our proposal went. That volume was already dated. If you think that the chapters were being written in like 2011 or 2012, and now we're already 5 years later thinking about moving on. Some of the research can be updated, and there were aspects that weren't really considered in that volume. You've seen the contents. It didn't really talk about lifespan perspectives on learning, didn't really talk about individual differences and the factors influencing differences in outcomes. One of the popular approaches out there to try and something now, does getting really aerobically fit improve your learning? Does learning a musical instrument, does that make you cleverer? These kind of methods out there proposed to enhance cognition. Okay, so this, which we said, we've got to set the scene in the volume with some introductory chapters, something that kind of frames our view of educational neuroscience. And then a second volume, we should cover some structural brain, the parts of the brain, as it were, and something about the methods that are being used within educational neuroscience to collect the data to build our theories. And then we thought we're going to have some separate sections. The first section will be how neuroscience kind of wanted to have chapters here that went from early years to preschool to early middle childhood to adolescence and to adult learning. So that would be section 1, and then section 2, then we focus on the individual difference. So we do the lifespan bit, and then we'd have a section on individual differences, and maybe a little bit about, the differences coming from genetic factors. Are they coming from environmental factors? And maybe think a little bit about what are the implications of individual differences for personalized learning. And we sort of saw that as being situated, that kind of debate in different areas: language, literacy, numeracy, science, similar kind of areas to the first volume, but thinking about variability. And then we thought we'd have this section on cognitive enhancement and sort of brain plasticity. Are there ways we can make cognition generally better in children? And then we'd have a final section that would think about issues about translation to policy, the teacher's perspective on all of the previous contents, and then, as editors, our conclusions on what we learned. We did feel we had a challenge, particularly so this is a volume where we have contributions from lots of different chapter authors, that how we were going to ensure that we could tie everything together in common themes. So rather than having all these kind of disparate topics, trying to have themes that ran through the whole book. So our way to do that was, in our instructions to our contributing authors, we said, at the end of your chapter, can you answer 3 different questions, or at least have 3 different sections at the end? The first question: what has neuroscience added to our understanding of the particular educational or psychological phenomenon, educational phenomenon over and above psychology? So what's the added value of neuroscience in your view? And the second was, could you articulate what you think the concrete implications of the research are for the classroom, for translation? And then we asked them to give further resources for the reader to learn more about the topic. It was quite painful in the end to ensure that all the authors put that section at the end of their chapters. They require some reminding. And at the end of the proposal, we said, here's our wish list of all the different scientists, researchers, educators that we might potentially invite to contribute to this structure that we're articulating. And that was 34 possible contributors. And this is the vision, right? This is, if it all works out ideally, but of course it never always works out ideally. You end up getting more contents in some areas than you thought, and you can't find authors to cover certain topics. And then the publisher has given you a maximum length that they feel that they can publish within the price bracket that they have in mind for the volume. So a lot of constraints going on, and this is what we finally ended up with. So it's kind of similar. So we do have these introductory kind of introduction and methods section. We have our conclusion section, but you'll see now there were 5 different content sections. The thing that we didn't manage to do was to have this kind of lifespan perspective where we separately have chapters looking at early years and primary and secondary and so forth. In the end, that kind of got handled in lots of different topics. So that developmental aspect is kind of in the content chapters itself. One thing that a new section that we added was having separate authors think about the 2 sides of the nature-nurture argument in education. So we had a chapter looking at genetic research in education, and then another chapter looking at one of the principal dimensions from the environment that seems to predict variation in educational outcomes. That's socioeconomic status. Then in section 2, that was kind of our content where we're looking at reading and oral language and maths and conceptual development, often as it pertains to science. We also had section 3 also had these kind of particular topics. These kind of accord to domains of psychology, but we split these between what we call discipline-specific abilities and discipline general abilities. And the motivation for that was really because we have this particular idea of like how the brain works, right? That's informing how we think that the research should proceed. And it's this kind of model that says you can break the brain down into lots of content-specific processing systems, which are specialized for particular domains or particular sub-operations. And then you have kind of like a control or modulatory system that activates or deactivates these content systems. And if you think of like an educational topic like maths is, from the point of view of the brain, maths is lots of different operations, some involving language or rules, some involving spatial cognition, procedures and so forth. And the control system has to, on the fly, wire together the particular components that are going to deliver that skill, the sensory and motor and attentional skills that are going to pull together the required skills in the moment. But also that the system has a reward system that's driving kind of motivation, it's kind of involved in response to feedback, but also an emotion system which is linked to, am I interested, am I motivated, curious. And then this summarize the idea that the individual in their environment. So this is a just specific or discipline research systems versus more like kind of the control, reward, emotion side of it, which I would apply to all topics. So that was the motivation of pulling apart these 2 sections into discipline specific and discipline general. Then we have our section on cognitive enhancement, and I think we were pretty pleased about this, that we had topics or chapters that cover many of the leading proposals for what might generally enhance cognition, things like action video game playing, mindfulness training, sleep, aerobic exercise, bilingualism and musical training. So we had kind of experts in those domains review the evidence about the extent to which these different kind of aspects would produce general versus specific benefits. Then we had our kind of section 5 into the classroom. Paul Howard-Jones put together a new chapter thinking about kind of the neuroscience of teaching and how neuroscience can feed into the teacher's self-reflection on their practice. A bonus that we weren't expecting to begin with, Victoria Noland wrote a chapter for us on the new ethical perspectives generated by educational neuroscience, the genetics of young kids to predict how education might be personalized for them, or what are the ethics around doing lots of testing on young kids when they can't really consent to that, and there's data protection issues, and there's generally an issue of testing on minors, but also whether the new kinds of technologies that we're looking at might have additional ethical implications. And then there's that chapter that we're going to hear more about from Derek Bell and Helen Darlington next week. So what I'm going to do in the next 20 minutes or so is have a look at this sort of framing chapter, and then also the kind of key themes that emerged from the volume. And then I'll wrap up by saying whether we thought we hit our targets, whether we were happy with the volume as it finally came out. Okay, so I'm going to skip kind of the contents of the introductory chapter. We felt we wanted to set out a modest goal. So no grand arguments that education was lost without neuroscience, that it couldn't progress, but really a modest goal saying cognitive neuroscience, we think it can be helpful to educators. And we try to put aside the distractions, challenges, things like being used as a kind of window.
Hi, Fred. I think we've lost you. Oh, apologies, everyone. I think Michael Thomas had warned us that his internet might go. And yes, the auto text. Oh, here you are. Hi, Michael. Sorry, you were gone. You're on mute now as well. So
I hope you filled in for me.
No, I just said like, oh, look, he's gone. No, I can't fill in yet. But I'm only just starting on the book to read it. Maybe the auto text. Maybe
yeah, it's very long.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, let me share screen again. And
oh wait, do I need to make you a host again? Sorry, everybody, for the.
You may need to make me host. Yeah.
Okay, I'll do that. That should be possible now, and I'll let you get back onto it.
Okay. Hope you can hear me again. Sorry about that dropout. So let's move on from here. This was the general framing that we offered to try and situate educational neuroscience. We pulled out a couple of figures from a review that we published in 2019, which just distinguished two ways that education and neuroscience could interact with each other. I think the more popular or more common approach is to think about neuroscience informing psychological theories, and those psychological theories informing educational practice. These are all double-headed arrows trying to demarcate that this should be an ongoing conversation between researchers in all these areas. But also we argued for the potential of a direct route that if you think about the brain as a biological organ that has certain requirements for energy and responds in a certain way to stress, and that if you're fit, you have better delivery of oxygen to the brain and so forth, that you might think about some possible direct routes that don't require psychological concepts to know that if the brain's getting more oxygen, it's likely to have better function. And we also had this figure to emphasize that people often, and it's not, I mean, that's part of it. It's one of the many methods. There's also actually looking at neural circuitry, at understanding the biology of using animal models, of looking at individual cell function and so forth. It's a bunch of different methods to understand how the brain produces its functions, right? And then we also use this diagram to emphasize that we're not viewing educational neuroscience as the kind of whole kit caboodle, that it's really looking at the individual and aspects of the individual, but all of that is embedded in these wider, and thinking about, you know, the teacher, the school model, constraints about technology, cultural influences, socioeconomic status, we already mentioned, and that within the education budget and educational policy. So we're not naive in thinking that all there is single brains. We're seeing, you know, we're contributing in the middle of this circle, while understanding that all these other constraints are also important. Okay, we made some apologies early on, and I wanted to get these out of the way early on in the volume. One of them was to admit that educational neuroscience is still kind of early days, and there are significant challenges in the job of translating basic research into a useful form that will be helpful in the classroom. That's hard, whether it's neuroscience or psychology. So psychology has been in studying learning and memory for over 100 years, and there are still things that psychologists are really convinced do or don't help learning, which haven't been translated well into the classroom. So translation is a challenge for anyone. And also what we're trying to do to look at learning in the brain, we have to realize that it's complicated. Okay, so yes, learning is probably changing the strength of the connections between neurons. But if you're trying to understand how the brain works, there are at least 8 different neural systems one could identify that are interacting with each other, that look at learning concepts and learning procedures and autobiographical memory. And the brain has a drive to make things automated and automatic, and we can learn from instruction and we can learn from observation. So there's a lot going on in the brain. Each of those systems may have a different preferred diet of experience, may have different kind of ways of consolidating, and may have different forgetting curves. So, you know, what we're trying to do is quite complex. I don't think I'll go through all of these. This is trying to deal with all the criticisms that are out there about why applying neuroscience to educational outcomes can't be done. All sorts of things. So yes, there are a lot of criticisms, and I get a bit tired about this, but you know, some of these are attempts to argue that neuroscience data is just the wrong kind of thing in principle because it can't be applied in the classroom. And this all feels very defensive to me, to argue, you know, before you've seen any results, it just can't be done. And you know, I'm happy to grant that the translation is hard and requires lots of dialogue and lots of thinking about how neural data can inform, can test cognitive models, and how cognitive models can inform teaching practices. So it's complicated, but I think a priority arguments are mistaken, that it's still early days, and in some areas, this kind of summarizing when I'm, so yes,
Oops. Are you back? Oh, you're on mute again. Sorry. I know. I'll let you.
Back.
You're back. You're still co-host, so you should be able to share.
Signal. All right. Okay, so study of biological learning systems offer anything helpful to educator. Much more modest. And there's another criticism we get about the stuff that comes out of educational neuroscience that teachers already knew that. You know, we knew 400 years ago that chewing the bark of the cinchona tree helped alleviate the symptoms of malaria. And we could have just left it there, right? But instead, we have hundreds of years of natural sciences which actually produce much more enhanced medicines for malaria. If you just stopped when you had something that kind of worked, then you'd never have the chance to improve it and optimize it, and you'd still be chewing the bark of the cinchona tree. So in other words, just because we have teachers that kind of know how things work, doesn't mean they can't be improved by it. Okay, so that's all a big field where there is resistance, where the approach is frustrating because all of this is really just historical about the way we structure universities into departments and disciplines, and people that are defending their disciplines instead of like a commercial engineering approach where you want to build a bridge across a valley. You just get together all the different specialist teams to crack the problem, right? The planners and the engineers and you know, mathematicians. You just get everyone in a room and you crack the problem, and you don't have arguments that we should have engineers, but we don't need builders and we don't need architects. You know, who's better? It's all kind of strange. Anyway, 18 chapters of content. Go buy the book. You can read what's in the middle, and I will jump to the conclusions. So we had a look as the emerging themes, what came out of the book, you know, about what teachers should know about neuroscience. And, you know, I think that's we have courses. I have a master's course on educational neuroscience, and that we have educators on that. Is it essential for teachers to know a lot about neuroscience? If not, what is it that they should get out of the involvement in neuroscience of education? Well, I think we were quite brave. We actually made a proposal in our conclusion. We said we believe that what teachers need to know about neuroscience is threefold: a broad characterization of how learning works in the brain in order to generate intuitions about the factors that may harness learning, an understanding of how their own brain function may influence their teaching skills, and awareness of the importance of convergent evidence across disciplines in evaluating whether teaching methods work. So that was our kind of how we think we summarize it. I think teachers, their practice will be enhanced by having a kind of gist of understanding how the brain works. And that doesn't mean being in contact with new papers in neuroscience or even understanding how brain imaging works and so forth. So many of the chapters touched on that issue. There was discussion in the volume about the strengths and weaknesses of a developmental approach versus an individual differences approach. So by a developmental approach in maths, say we might ask, how is it that children can learn maths at all? That tends to look at change across age. It involves cross-sectional studies with certain kinds of limitations. But another question is, what makes kids better or worse at learning maths? There's probably more research in that individual differences approach, where you get a big bunch of kids and look at correlations between their different cognitive skills and maths outcomes. The problem with those approaches is they kind of tell you about the limiting factors, the things that are holding kids back, not necessarily on what all the contributory skills are. There was quite a significant debate that popped up across the volume on how to evaluate what works. What kind of studies should we be using if we want to evaluate the effectiveness of different types of educational technique? And obviously, if you want to build or accumulate an evidence base of useful techniques, you need to decide what the right studies are. And there are proposals of, you maybe need to go through this sequence of feasibility studies and mechanism studies, and then efficacy studies to put it out there in classrooms, scale it up into big studies, and then effectiveness studies where you do the same thing again, but with that much less control over the quality of the application of the method. And then we considered the pros and cons of large-scale randomized control trials of the kinds advocated by the Education Endowment Foundation. That's kind of the gold standard using the kind of medical model. The great thing about randomized control trials, that means you're only varying, you have a test, an intervention group, a control group, and you try and only vary one thing between them. And if you're doing it even more rigorously, you'll have some kind of active control that's doing another intervention activity, but you don't think it's going to improve the skill you're looking at. The problem with those approaches is, in general, it's making it look like nothing works. We get lots of small effect sizes from those big randomized control trials, and that's because so much else is varying in the background. So there's a lot of noise against which you're trying to detect small signals. So if you only focused on RCTs, you might give up. Nothing seems to work. We do all this research and then we run RCTs and nothing seems to work. On the other hand, we do know that there are kind of approaches where you target kids in say, disadvantaged circumstances who are struggling, say, poor kids in secondary school and in deprived areas, and you go in and you just throw the kitchen sink to help these kids, and you motivate them and you give them extra skills training, and you get their parents on board, and you give them a fitness instructor and a chef to sort out their diet and structure their time to do their homework and all these kind of things. And you can get really big effect sizes. So we're left with this odd situation where huge effect sizes by throwing everything at it, but at the end of it, you're not really sure which of those was the effective thing. Why did it work? Versus highly controlled situations where if it works, you'll know exactly why, but it doesn't seem to work, or very small effect sizes. So we have this contrast. Is there something we can do in between those two to try and have interventions and evaluate interventions with bigger effect sizes than we see in the RCTs, but more experimental control to give us an understanding of mechanism that we see in the child-centered approach? Why do we need to understand mechanism if they work? Because these are kind of boutique interventions for small groups of children run by really invested parties. And in order to scale these up, we need to know what the key ingredients are, because in the effective forms they currently are, we can't scale all those resources up. And that leads to a bigger debate about what effect sizes on any of our educational techniques or interventions should we be expecting. And maybe if it's like the public health model, well, sure, there were things like vaccines and improving cleanliness, and having good drains and good water supply, things that had big effects. But in the main, the public health model shows that lifespan and public health is increased by the accumulation of many small effects, and maybe educational outcomes will be similar to that. And this is kind of a broad attention. If educational neuroscience is focusing on mechanisms, that's trying to understand how it works. but that's sort of different from getting it to work. And you can see the child-centered approaches are much more, we just want something to work, we'll throw everything at it. But the randomized control trials are much more, we want to understand how it works, so we need much more experimental control. We have some consideration of translation and policy and some of the lessons that came out of that. So some of the things that researchers don't think about, they say, oh, we want to get some solid evidence about methods that might work, and then we'll take these to policymakers. And then policy actually often involves mandating national practice. And then you, as a researcher, you go, is that what you wanted? That teachers are going to be told to use your method in a compulsory fashion? Isn't that going to upset the teachers? Or maybe really, I think it's more realistic to say that the aim of research is just to provide a wider set of tools and to trust that the teachers will be able to apply the best tools to the best situation. So I'm not sure that researchers have thought in enough detail about what outcomes they want from their research. And indeed, certainly if you look at academics and researchers, they're not very good at communicating with policymakers. Really, you need a communication strategy so that you can agree a consensus view, which is then communicated to policymakers, rather than having kind of academic debates in front of the policymakers that just undermine their confidence in the field, however legitimate those theoretical debates are. I think educational neuroscience is going to continue to have a struggle with how to respond to policymakers who are enthusiastic to embody neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience in their policy making, when in many cases we're still in the early days of the field. Do we say it's premature to think about how brain plasticity could inform the maths curriculum? Or as researchers, do we try and make a best guess about what we think it means, having spoken to teachers about what might work in the classroom? I'm not sure what the best solution is there, but it is worth bearing in mind if researchers don't communicate with policymakers, other people will be talking to policymakers. And if other people's approach is not as evidence-based as educational neuroscience or even just a psychological approach, then you're missing out by being too cautious, or you're not being responsible, as it were. So there's still a challenge of trying to find a balance between not overselling the science, but not underselling the importance of science to policymakers. What were the conclusions from can we enhance cognition? So what came out of that section was, in general, what you practice, you get better on. So what's called near transfer, the things that you practice, you improve. But even though there's that idea out there that there may be something that if we practice, everything else will improve, a kind of magic technique, whichever one you want to call it, learning a second language, learning a musical instrument, getting there doesn't seem to be strong evidence that any of these techniques have a general benefit. Now, general benefit is an improvements which transfer to quite distant skills than the one you're training. It's a bit of a free lunch idea. Maybe, I must buy myself one of these to have a fantastic physique and get fit. You don't have to do any exercise or lift up weights. You can just sit on the sofa, watch TV, and attach some electrical stimulation. God knows how that works, but it is hugely cut price. Look, £8 down from £30. What a great deal. So the idea of far transfer is that there should be an easy and magical solution that train on one activity and you can improve all activities. If that is at all possible, I think it's going to happen through the direct pathway to improve kind of the biological brain function, the substrate, maybe to do with diet or reduction of stress, or physical fitness, I don't think there will be cognitive techniques that are going to yield general benefits. There is one possible exception to that, and that is, what if we train people to do far transfer? That's the kind of thing you might do using metacognition, the kind of thing that may not be appropriate for younger kids, but maybe in adolescence. And that is really explicit training of how you apply what you know to new situations. And I think that may be a kind of neglected area of hoping for magic, that you'll learn the piano and that'll improve all your grades, that we should be more focused or just train for far transfer. So what came out of that was kind of a rule of thumb that magic cognitive techniques purported to lead to far transfer are probably baloney. You do get a lot of publications in this area, suggesting, apparent hard evidence for cognitive enhancement. The problem there tends to be there's not random allocation to conditions. So if you see, is bilingualism better for your brain than monolingualism? Well, you haven't got a random selection of babies that you randomly assigned to be bilinguals or to be monolinguals. And because the allocation to condition isn't controlled, there can be confounding factors. For instance, that bilinguals may systematically differ from monolinguals for other reasons, and that might produce your results. So back to those unifying themes, we asked our authors, what do they think is the added value of neuroscience? After I'd done this, I kind of wondered whether it was the right thing to do, because it is, it gives a unifying theme, and it addresses a question out there for critics of educational neuroscience. What's the neuroscience adding? But in the end, I think that's approaching things from the critic's point of view, where they cast somehow the enterprise of improving educational outcomes as a competition between different disciplines. That somehow it's who's better, neuroscience or psychology, and ultimately that doesn't really make any sense. It's an interdisciplinary approach where all the different approaches inform each other. So maybe this was the wrong kind of question to ask. So what kind of things did our authors respond with? Well, they said things like the neuroscience evidence can have more impact on researchers and policymakers than just behavioral studies. Sometimes we've got behavioral data that we don't quite believe, and that neuroscience data can be kind of independent and confirm it. So things like IQ seems to change across the teenage years, but some skeptics have said, no, really IQ is fixed. The IQ doesn't really change after age 10. And if it appears to change across the teenage years, well, that's just a measurement problem. Whereas actually, there were studies showing that there were correlated changes in gray matter that correlated with the changes in teenagers' IQ over a 4-year period. So that studying the brain actually confirms something that we suspected in the behavior. Neuroscience can support interventions by explaining how they work. So why would playing action video games improve reading accuracy in dyslexics? And you can go into that and find out it's an enhancement in peripheral top-down attention, for example. And that makes you believe this as being a plausible intervention. And also there were claims that there were new ideas generated from the neuroscience that weren't really present in just a psychological approach. So things like, so Usha Goswami's work suggesting that in dyslexia, it may be a problem in rhythm processing. So you can practice poetry. If you practice poetry, it may improve your reading. Identifying symbolic magnitude as a key constraint in mathematical concept learning, different aspects of brain development in adolescence, informing what skills may be developing and most malleable at that age, and some others, right? So there are claims that new ideas can come out of the neuroscience that are stimulated by combining neuroscience data with cognitive data that weren't there before. We also asked our authors what are the concrete implications of neuroscience for the classroom. Some authors were cautious about saying, well, you can't really just go from neuroscience to the classroom. So Paul Howard-Jones and colleagues said, look, take brain imaging, nothing that we're measuring in the brain of our participants really replicates what it's like to be in the classroom. So we have to be very careful about using brain imaging evidence to think about behavior in the classroom. There were other concrete examples being offered, say that neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, was helping to identify the core skills in domains. Imordino, Yang, and Gottlieb argued for the importance of the role of emotion in learning, that if you go into learning from a educational neuroscience point of view, it suggests intellectual virtues of things like interest, curiosity, intellectual humility, and intellectual agency. This is an attempt from a neuroscience perspective to sort of subtly shape the agenda to foreground certain kinds of skills. And it's part of a sort of neuroscience analysis of if you look at the I'm going to use a bad term, but the design constraints of the brain, the evolutionary selective pressures that shape brain structure. What are the brain's priorities? Well, roughly sensory motor is the most important, making the right movements in response to the right perceptions. Number two is emotions. Those are things that are so important for the organism that they've been built into the structure, like the amygdala and hippocampus and so forth. Number three, as social primates, is people. Lots of our brain is dedicated to thinking about what other people do. Number four is cognition. Those are the kind of skills that we're trying to impart when we teach people to learn about fractions and long division and these kind of things. It's kind of cognitive things. If you want to optimize cognition, the learning, shaping cognition, what you need to do is to make sure the first three priorities are aligned and not getting in the way of that fourth priority. And that's kind of what Imordino, Yang, and Gottlieb are arguing, particularly from the point of view of emotions, so that you don't want to be scared about maths, you want to be curious about maths. But you can also argue it about people that having the right relationship with the teacher as a kind of mentor figure and trusting them as an authority figure will help you focus on the kind of content of the skills you're being taught. And then the final concrete implication, this is again Paul Howard-Jones's work, is to think about neuroscience concepts to try and help teachers to support their self-reflection in their practice. I'm almost time to wrap up now. At the end of the book, we kind of identified some future directions that we thought were good avenues for education and neuroscience to go down, to think more about personalizing learning based on individual differences and prior knowledge, to think about using technology to support learning. Obviously, that's become more important now with the pandemic and a lot of children forced to use online learning. We put this sentence in, I put it in, and the other editors said I should not put it in, but I thought it was quite fun. So if Facebook can tailor advertisements and swing elections, surely such technology can tailor tuition and swing examinations. Maybe we shouldn't have put that in. Other dimensions or directions I think are important, the role of emotion in learning and the neuroscience of teaching. So there were things that we wanted to include in the book.
Sorry, Michael, but it's already over 5 o'clock. I'm aware that people might have to go.
Okay. All right. Sorry. So I will. Did we achieve what we wanted to do? It was more expensive than we thought. And see you again in 7 years. So I'll wrap up there. So anyone who needs to leave, feel free to do so. And anyone has any questions, please fire away.
Yeah. Sorry about that, Michael. You know, got some good presentation, lots of things to think about. We've got a number of questions. Let me just start. Maybe Spencer can help me go through the ones that might be, you know, most fun probably. But there was a question from Paul Winter around how you determine the impact of this book on teaching in the UK.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I guess producing the volume is such a lot of hard work that you're glad that you ever get the book out, let alone then following it and seeing what impact it has. I guess that is a missing area in educational neuroscience that many of us have been aware of, and that we would like to work on, and that is investing more time in the translation and actually having that as a specific activity that you put resources in. Because at the moment, this is partly to do with the structure of funding in UK research, that individual research projects gain funding. And there aren't really sources to fund translation, to put teachers and researchers in the same room and say, right, let's find out in a given area, what are the challenges that teachers are facing and what is the state of the research? And now you guys talk to each other and see, are there productive ways forward to use the research to come up with new ideas for teaching, or for the teachers to convince researchers their areas that they need to work in. So I'm very much of the view that we need to invest in the translation activity, and we're still at the stage of producing books like this and hoping they have an influence. There's more to be done there. I certainly agree with that.
That's great. I think, yeah, another question that was, is if you look at brain, this is from Alison Whelan, if you think that much of the brain growth happens between the early years, so say 0 to 3 years old, then, isn't that an area of research that should the research focus on that age, or should that be communicated to parents as well as teachers around that importance?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a question that comes up in educational neuroscience from its birth, shall we say, back in the 1990s, where some of the emerging work there, looking at sensitive periods and the importance of the first 1,000 days, that was kind of hijacked by policymakers to push forward an early years agenda and actually to redirect investment into the early years from older ages. And that led to a backlash, and John Brewer is one influential figure there that said this is just premature, right? We don't know enough about the neuroscience to know that certainly early years you can mess up children's potential, but it's not clear that if you put in that potential there by investing a lot of effort and neglect later parts, that you don't have a bad effect as well. And indeed, we've probably I've spoken to policymakers, select committees about trying to rein back from that and say, no, really, what early years you're creating potential, and then in kind of mid-childhood and adolescence, you're realizing potential. So I'm for a lifespan perspective. There is work to be done to understand when things go wrong early on, how they can be fixed. But really,
oh, and at that point, Michael was lost again. Oh.
Story outside of severe things that have to be fixed early on for reasons in motor systems to do with, do that, in the first year that we're looking at in children's development have much more extended plasticity. So yeah, the kind of neuroscience that's relevant to different age groups will differ. It's basic socio-emotional, sensory motor systems for the early years, behavioral regulation and so forth. And then we're looking at kind of core cognitive skills in the middle years. And then when we get into adolescence, it's much more about the kind of social skills, perspective taking, decision making. And then we have to think in older groups about retraining and brain plasticity. If you lose your job when you're age 40, is that it? Can you not learn anymore? And then even, are there activities that aging adults can do that can give them some kind of more preservation against cognitive decline? So I don't think we put all our eggs in an early years basket, and I think indeed there are risks of doing that.
Well, there are some more questions, but other people are helpfully also providing some answers in the chat box.
Well done, everyone else.
I know, exactly. Seeing it's past the time, I think it's maybe time for us to wrap up. And some of these debates probably will continue next week with the next speaker, because obviously they're also picking up on themes in the book as well. And in terms of neuromyths and other areas, I'm sure we're going to have more talks in the next few weeks around these topics. So thank you very much, Michael, for a very interesting talk and for introducing the book. As I said, many of us have now already downloaded the link. Do you have a link we can distribute maybe when we do the recording, or maybe next week's talk, so that people can have a look at it?
So yes, just go on to Amazon if you want to buy the book. It's way expensive, but given that we're all friends in this group, I have online versions of the introduction and conclusion if you want to read those, and those can be circulated.
Fantastic. Well, thanks very much. Have a good week, everybody who's listening today, and see you all next week. Thank you.
Thank you.